I felt my hands go still on the table. Not tense, not shaking, just still, the way they used to get right before I stood up in a courtroom and delivered the kind of closing argument that made grown men pale. I hadn't felt that stillness in years. I thought I'd left it behind when I retired. But sitting in that private dining room, watching a man pour a glass of red wine down the front of my daughter's white dress, on purpose, slowly, deliberately, with a smile on his face, I felt it come back like an old friend. My son-in-law laughed. He actually laughed. And that was when I knew exactly what I was going to do. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I live alone in a 3-bedroom house in Raleigh, North Carolina, the same house where I raised my daughter after her mother passed. The house needs a new roof. The gutters have been crooked since a storm 2 years ago. I drive a 2014 Camry with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat that doesn't recline anymore. I wear the same 4 pairs of slacks on rotation. I get my hair cut at a barbershop that charges $18, because I've been going there for 20 years and I see no reason to change. People look at me and see a quiet old man, a retired school teacher maybe, someone's grandfather, someone easy to dismiss. That's fine. I never needed anyone to know what I was. My daughter, Claire, is 31. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh and a stubbornness that is entirely her own. She spent 6 years building a career in nonprofit healthcare administration, working longer hours than most people half her age, for a salary that reflected none of her effort. She is the most decent person I know. She deserves someone who saw that. Whether she found that person in her fiancé, Daniel, is something I tried to give the benefit of the doubt. Daniel was 34, an architect at a firm in Charlotte. He seemed genuine enough when they were dating. He was attentive, well-spoken, brought flowers the first time he came to my house for dinner. I noticed he checked his phone a lot. I noticed he talked about himself more than he asked about her. But Claire was happy, and I had learned a long time ago that love is not a case I can argue. What I could not ignore was Daniel's father. Marcus Holt was 61 years old and had spent the last 2 decades building a commercial real estate empire across the Southeast. He was the kind of man who wore his wealth the way other men wear cologne constantly, in every room, so that you were never allowed to forget it. He drove a car that cost more than most people's houses. He had an office in uptown Charlotte on the 22nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows. And I know this because he mentioned it within the first 4 minutes of meeting me. The first time I met Marcus was at a dinner Claire arranged about 8 months before the wedding. A restaurant he chose, a place where the menu had no prices on it, which I've always found to be a kind of theater. He shook my hand and looked me over, the way a man looks at something he's already decided what is beneath him. He asked what I did. I told him I was retired. He asked from what? I said public service. He nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. Over dinner, he talked about the firm, about a development deal he was closing in Tennessee, about a property in Savannah that was going to be, in his words, transformational. He used the word transformational 6 times. I counted. Claire squeezed my hand under the table. I smiled and ate my steak and said very little. On the drive home, I thought about what I had seen in his eyes when he looked at me. Not rudeness, exactly. Something quieter than that. Indifference. The particular indifference of a man who has decided that some people are worth his attention and some are not, and that the criteria for that decision is money and nothing else. I had prosecuted men like Marcus for 26 years, not always for the same crimes, but for the same quality of thinking. I said nothing to Claire. She was happy. The wedding was 8 months away. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man and that I should let my daughter live her life. Then the rehearsal dinner happened. It was the Friday evening before the wedding. The venue was a private room at a steakhouse in Charlotte that Marcus had reserved and paid for, which I appreciated. Even if I understood that generosity of this kind from men like him always comes with a ledger. There were about 30 people in the room. Claire's friends, Daniel's groomsmen, both families, a few colleagues of Marcus's that I didn't recognize and weren't introduced to. I arrived with my sister, Patricia, who had driven up from Fayetteville to be there for Claire. We were the first of Claire's family to arrive. A server offered champagne, I took a glass and stood near the window and watched the room fill up. Marcus arrived last, which I suspected was intentional. He walked in with his wife, Diane, and two men I didn't know, still talking about something that was clearly more important than the room he'd just entered. He acknowledged Claire with a brief hug. He shook Daniel's hand. He nodded at me from across the room the way you nod at someone whose name you can't quite remember. Dinner was served at a long rectangular table. I was seated near the middle, across from one of Daniel's groomsmen and next to my sister. Marcus was at the head of the table, because of course he was. Claire was seated near him, which was either a gesture of inclusion or a mistake she would soon regret. For the first hour, things were manageable. Dinner was served. Conversation flowed. People told stories about the couple. One of Claire's friends gave a little speech that made my sister cry. I felt the kind of cautious happiness you feel when you want something to go well, and it seems to be going well. Then Marcus ordered a second bottle of wine, and the performance began. It started with a comment I was not meant to hear, but was absolutely meant to hear. He was talking to one of his colleagues, the volume slightly higher than necessary, about a charity gala he'd attended the previous month. He mentioned the venue, a historic property in Charleston. He mentioned the guest list. He mentioned the auction items. And then, without looking at me, he said, "Of course, not everyone there could afford to participate, but it's good for people to see how things are done." No one at the table reacted. I picked up my water glass. A few minutes later, he turned to Claire, the way someone turns to someone when they want an audience rather than a conversation, and said, "Claire, I keep meaning to ask. Your father, what exactly did he do in public service?" Daniel mentioned something, but I couldn't quite follow it. Claire looked at me with an expression I recognized. The expression of a woman who loves two people and is watching a collision she can't stop. "He was a federal prosecutor," she said. "For 26 years. Marcus raised his eyebrows the way people do when something surprises them less than they're pretending. "A prosecutor. Government work." He nodded slowly. "Good for you, Walter. Honest work." The way he said honest work sat in my chest like a small stone. I smiled. "Thank you, Marcus. I imagine the government doesn't pay much," he said to the table. "Not to me. But there's something noble about it, I suppose. Choosing service over success." My sister's fork made a small sound against her plate. Claire opened her mouth. I caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of my head. She closed it again. This was not the moment. I knew how to read a room. I had spent my career knowing which moments were worth spending and which were not. This was not the moment. The moment came about 40 minutes later. Dessert had been served. Daniel was talking to one of his groomsmen at the far end of the table. I was speaking quietly with Patricia about her drive up from Fayetteville. Claire was telling a story to the woman on her left, laughing, relaxed in a way she hadn't been all evening. I heard Marcus's voice shift, the specific register that means someone is about to make a point. "You know what I told Daniel when he said he was serious about Claire?" Marcus said it to the table, casually, the way you tell a story you've told before. I told him, "Son, I raised you to know the difference between sentiment and sense, between a woman who fits your life and a woman who fits your feelings." The table quieted. Daniel was not looking at his father. He was not looking at Claire. He was looking at his dessert plate. "I told him the family you marry into matters as much as the person you marry," Marcus continued. "Resources, networks, standing. Those things travel down through families. They shape what's possible." I watched Claire's expression change. Watched the happiness drain out of it, slowly, like water from a cracked glass. "Marcus," his wife said quietly. He wasn't finished. "Claire is a lovely girl," he said, and the word girl landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "I have nothing against her personally, but I want Daniel to understand what he's walking into, what's available to him and what isn't. Because at a certain level of life, Walter, now he looked at me directly, compatibility is about more than feelings. You understand that, don't you? In your experience?" I looked at him for a moment. "I understand a great many things about compatibility," I said. "Yes." He smiled the smile of a man who thinks he's just won something. Then he reached for the bottle of red wine in front of him. He was going to refill his glass. And whether what happened next was intentional or whether it was the wine already in his system, or whether it was simply the contempt of a man who had stopped caring whether his contempt was visible. The bottle tilted toward Claire, not toward her glass, toward her. Red wine poured across the front of her cream-colored dress, the dress she was wearing the night before her wedding. The table went silent. Claire sat very still, the way people go still when they're trying to decide if they're going to cry. Marcus looked at the wine spreading across the fabric, and he said, with a kind of bemused sigh, "Oh, Claire, you should have been more careful. You should have been more careful." I set down my glass. My son-in-law looked at his father. He did not reach for a napkin. He did not say anything. He looked at his father with an expression that I can only describe as nervous, not angry, not horrified, not protective of his fiancée on the eve of their wedding. Nervous. The expression of a man who has spent his whole life managing his father's moods and is running the calculation right now. I heard one of the groomsmen say something under his breath. I heard my sister make a sound that was not a word. I stood up, not quickly, not with the energy of a man about to start a scene. I stood up the way I used to stand up in courtrooms, deliberately, without apology. I picked up my napkin and walked to Claire and placed it in her hands and said quietly, "Go with Patricia to the restroom. Take your time." Claire looked up at me. Her eyes were bright with the specific anger of a woman who has been humiliated in front of people who were supposed to celebrate her. "Dad." "Go ahead, sweetheart," I said. "I'll be right here." Patricia stood and took Claire's hand, and they left the room together. I turned back to the table. Marcus was refilling his glass, unhurried, as if nothing of particular note had occurred. "Marcus," I said. He looked up. "I want to make sure I understand what just happened," I said. "Did you just pour wine on my daughter the night before her wedding and tell her it was her fault?" The table was very quiet. Marcus met my eyes with the expression of a man who is recalculating. "It was an accident, Walter. The bottle slipped." "These things happen at dinner." "The bottle slipped," I said. "That's right. And then you told her she should have been more careful." "A beat. I may have misspoken," he said. The man next to him shifted in his chair. I looked at Marcus for a long moment, long enough that the silence became something people could feel. "All right," I said. "Enjoy your dessert." I walked back to my seat. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I took my phone out of my pocket. I excused myself to the hallway. And I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man named Gerald, who had been my investigative paralegal for 11 years, and who had, after I retired, gone on to work as a senior compliance investigator for the Department of Justice's Real Estate Fraud Division. Gerald and I had dinner twice a year and talked on the phone more often than that. He picked up on the second ring. "Walter," he said. "Kind of late for a Friday." "I know," I said. "I need a favor, Gerald. Nothing official, just a question." "Go ahead." "Marcus Holt. Holt Commercial Real Estate, Charlotte. You know the name?" There was a pause. Not a long one. "Where are you right now?" Gerald said. "Rehearsal dinner," I said. "For my daughter." "His son is marrying your daughter?" "Tomorrow," I said. Another pause. "Peter," Gerald said slowly, "I can't tell you what I do or don't have on my desk. You know that." "I know," I said, "but I can tell you that the name you just said is not a name I'm unfamiliar with." I leaned against the wall in the hallway and let that sit for a moment. "How long?" I asked. "I really can't." "Ballpark." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "It's not a new file," he said. "Let's leave it at that." "All right," I said. "Thank you, Gerald." "Walter," he said before I hung up, "is your daughter all right?" I looked back toward the door of the dining room. "She will be," I said. The second call was to my former colleague, a woman named Diane Marsh, who was now the managing partner of one of Charlotte's larger civil litigation firms. I had mentored Diane when she was a young assistant U.S. attorney. She was, in my professional opinion, one of the sharpest legal minds I had encountered in my career. She didn't pick up, so I left a message asking her to call me at her earliest convenience on Monday morning. I told her it was regarding a potential civil matter, and that I'd explain when she called. I kept my voice even. I kept my message brief. Then I went back to check on Claire. She was in the small lounge area near the restrooms with Patricia, who had found her a club soda and was working on the stain with the calm efficiency of a woman who has handled worse. Claire had changed into the light cardigan she'd had in her bag. She looked steadier than I expected. She had her mother's composure. "How bad is it?" she asked when she saw my face. "The stain?" I said. "Patricia's handling it." "Dad," I sat down next to her. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me. Has Marcus done things like this before? Not necessarily the same thing, but this kind of behavior. Has Daniel talked about it? Have you seen it?" She was quiet for a moment. "He says things," she said, "at dinners. Comments about money, about what Daniel should be doing with his career. He once told Daniel in front of me that he was underperforming for a man of his background." She paused. "Daniel doesn't push back. He never pushes back." "Has Marcus said anything to you directly about the marriage?" She looked at her hands. "He called me once, about 4 months ago. He said he thought we were moving too fast, that Daniel needed to think about his future more carefully. He was polite about it, but it was clear what he meant." "What did Daniel say when you told him?" She looked at me. I understood. "Claire," I said, "whatever happens tomorrow or after tomorrow, you know that I am in your corner, completely. Do you understand that?" "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to let you make your own choices," I said, "as I always have. But I am going to make sure you have all the information you need to make them." She looked at me for a long moment. My daughter has her mother's eyes. When she's trying to figure something out, they get very still and very clear. "You already made a call, didn't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I made 2, I said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. We went back to the table. The rest of the evening passed without incident, the way evenings pass when everyone has agreed not to discuss the thing that just happened. Marcus was jovial and expansive. Daniel made a toast that mentioned Claire twice and his father once. My sister drank her coffee and said nothing. I smiled and thanked the servers and shook hands with people on the way out. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder at the door and said, "Good man, Walter, good man," like I'd passed a test. I told him to drive safely. The wedding happened the next day. Claire was beautiful. She walked down the aisle in a dress that was not the one she'd worn the night before, but a backup she'd had the foresight to pack, because my daughter is the kind of woman who plans for the contingencies that hope tells you won't occur. I cried, which I had not done in public since her mother's funeral. I danced with her to a song she'd chosen, and I held on to her and thought about every small moment it had taken to get to that one. I said nothing to Marcus that day. I was cordial. I was pleasant. I was the quiet, retired old man from Raleigh, with the crooked gutters and the cheap haircut. On Monday morning, Diane Marsh called me back at 7:45. I told her what I had. Not everything, the broad shape of it. She was quiet while I talked. When I finished, she said, "And your daughter is now legally connected to this family." "As of Saturday," I said. "All right," she said. "Let me look into the civil exposure. If there's a federal inquiry already open, we need to be careful not to step on it. But there may be things she needs to know about the financial structure of the family assets, depending on how Daniel is entangled." "That's exactly what I'm concerned about," I said. "I'll make some calls," she said. "Give me a week." I also called Claire that Monday. I told her I had some information developing that she needed to be aware of. I told her it was about Marcus and potentially about the business. I told her I wasn't certain yet and that I didn't want to alarm her, but that she had a right to know what I was looking into. I told her to be careful about signing anything related to Holt Commercial Real Estate and to let me know if Daniel asked her to. She was quiet for a moment. "How serious?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But I want you to have your eyes open." "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. She trusted me. She always had. That was the thing about the years of building something with your child, not the big moments, the graduations and the weddings, but the 10,000 small moments of honesty and patience and following through. That's what trust is actually made of. Marcus Holt would never understand that. He had a son who flinched when he entered the room. Diane called me back in 9 days. The picture she'd assembled, working with her firm's financial investigators and using publicly available records, was not a pretty one. Marcus Holt had built his commercial real estate empire over 20 years, and a significant portion of that empire had been built on a foundation of misrepresented appraisals, undisclosed related party transactions, and in at least 3 documented cases, what appeared to be outright fraud in loan applications to federally insured lenders. Gerald had confirmed, without confirming, that a civil investigation had been active for approximately 14 months. A parallel SEC inquiry had been opened after an investor complaint. Daniel, according to Diane's research, was listed as an officer of 2 Holt commercial subsidiary entities. He may or may not have been aware of what those entities were being used for, but his name was on the documents. I drove to Charlotte on a Thursday afternoon. I took Claire to dinner at a quiet restaurant, just the 2 of us, and I laid it out for her. All of it. Not as a prosecutor, not as a man with an agenda, as her father, who had spent 26 years watching what happens to the people who get caught in the orbit of men like Marcus and don't see it coming in time. She listened without interrupting. That had always been her way. She sat with her hands around her water glass, and she listened to everything I said. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Daniel doesn't know, she said finally, or he doesn't know the full picture. That may be true, I said. It may also be that he's told himself a version of events that allows him not to know. She looked at her glass. What do I do? She said. That's your decision, I said. Not mine, but you should have independent legal counsel who understands the full scope of this. Diane will represent you if you want her. She already knows the situation. And Marcus. I looked at my daughter. Marcus is going to have a very difficult next 18 months, I said. Regardless of anything you or I do, the people looking into him have been building this case for over a year. I didn't start that. I didn't accelerate it. I simply made sure that you were not standing in the wrong place when it arrived. Claire looked out the window for a moment. The restaurant was quiet. Outside, the Charlotte evening moved along, indifferent and ordinary. He poured wine on my dress, she said. Yes, I said. And then he told me it was my fault. Yes. She nodded slowly. Okay, Dad, she said. Okay. She called Diane the next morning. Within 3 weeks, with Diane's guidance, she had begun the process of untangling her own finances from Daniel's, quietly, carefully, before anything became public. She also began a series of conversations with Daniel that I was not privy to because they were hers to have. I don't know everything that was said. I know that Claire is a woman who asks the questions that need asking and listens to the answers without flinching. 4 months after the wedding, Marcus Holt was named in a federal civil complaint filed by the Department of Justice, alleging wire fraud, bank fraud, and securities violations involving over $40 million in misrepresented transactions across multiple Holt commercial subsidiaries. The complaint was detailed and meticulous, the kind of document that takes a long time to build and a very short time to destroy everything in its path. His lawyer released a statement, calling the charges baseless and politically motivated. I'd heard that particular statement many times over the years. It doesn't age well. 2 of his largest development partners withdrew from pending projects within a week of the filing. A bank that had been financing a mixed-use development in Nashville froze the construction account pending review. The 22nd floor office in Charlotte became the subject of a court order restricting the movement of company assets. Daniel was not named in the initial complaint. Whether that remained true depended on the cooperation he chose to offer. That conversation was between Daniel and his own attorney and whatever remained of his relationship with his father. It was not a conversation I could have for him. Marcus hired a team of attorneys. Of course he did. He had the resources for it. At least for now. The proceedings moved the way federal proceedings always move, slowly, methodically, with the particular patience of an institution that has learned that waiting is a form of pressure. I knew that pace well. I had worked inside it for 26 years. I knew what it felt like on both sides. In the months that followed, I watched from a distance. I read the court filings when they became available. I spoke to Diane periodically. I checked in on Claire, not to ask about the case, but because she was my daughter, and she was navigating something difficult, and I wanted her to know she wasn't navigating it alone. She and Daniel separated 7 months after the wedding. The specifics were theirs. What I know is that she called me the evening it happened, and that she was clear-eyed and steady, and that she said, "I need to know you're going to let me be sad about this without telling me it was the right decision." I told her, of course. "It probably was the right decision," she said. "I know," I said, "but I need to be sad first." "Take all the time you need," I said. She did. And then, the way her mother would have, she got up and kept going. Marcus Holt entered a plea agreement 19 months after the initial filing. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison on 3 counts of bank fraud and 2 counts of wire fraud. His assets were subject to civil forfeiture proceedings. The properties, the accounts, the development deals in Tennessee and Savannah and Nashville, all of it became subject to the slow, thorough machinery of federal judgment. Diane sent me this sentencing notice with a 1-line message. 11 years. Thought you'd want to know. I was at the barber shop when I read it, the same one I've been going to for 20 years. Joe was cutting my hair, and we were talking about his granddaughter's first birthday party and the weather coming in from the coast. I read the message, and I set my phone down on the little shelf beneath the mirror, and I looked at my reflection for a moment. Old man. Crooked gutters. $18 haircut. 2014 Camry. I thought about Marcus clapping me on the shoulder in the doorway of that restaurant and saying, "Good man, Walter." I thought about the way he'd said honest work, with that particular tilt of his voice that was meant to make me feel the weight of the lesser thing I had chosen. I thought about the career that honest work had built, the cases I'd argued, the evidence I'd assembled, the documents I'd read in quiet offices while men like Marcus were at galas with auctions they could afford, the knowledge I'd accumulated not to use, but to have the way some people keep tools in a garage, not because they need them every day, but because when the pipe breaks in the winter, the tool is there. I thought about 2 phone calls made from a hallway. I had not built a fortune. I had not built a firm. I had not built anything that could be listed on a balance sheet or included in a profile in a business magazine. But I had built a daughter who trusted me, and I had built, over 26 years of patient, unglamorous public service, a network of people who knew my word was worth something and who picked up the phone when I called. Marcus Holt had built an empire with a rotten foundation and never checked whether the ground beneath it would hold. I knew that kind of story. I had told it, in one form or another, to juries across 6 federal districts. The details changed. The names changed. The properties and the amounts and the particular mechanisms of the fraud changed, but the shape of the story was always the same. Arrogance is not intelligence. Power is not wisdom. And the man who dismisses you because of what he can see is always unprepared for what he can't. Joe finished the cut and handed me the mirror. "Looking good, Walter," he said. I looked at myself in the mirror. The gray, the lines. The face of a man who has buried a wife and raised a daughter and spent 3 decades in courtrooms arguing for a version of justice that is imperfect and slow and necessary. "Thank you, Joe," I said. I paid and I left him a tip, and I walked out into the afternoon and got in my car with the cracked dashboard, and I drove home to Raleigh. Claire called me that evening. She'd seen the news. 11 years, she said. "Yes," I said. "Is that enough?" I thought about her dress, about her face at that table, about the night before her wedding and the specific contempt of a man who had decided she wasn't worth the basic dignity of basic decency. "It's what the law provides for," I said. "In my experience, it's rarely about the number. It's about the fact that the reckoning came." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "You don't need to thank me," I said. "You protected yourself. You made the hard decisions. Diane did the work." "Dad." "Yes?" "You made 2 phone calls from a hallway," she said, "and you knew exactly who to call." I looked out the window at the gutters I still hadn't fixed. The light was going in the way it does in North Carolina in the fall, slow and gold, and not quite willing to give up. "I just made sure you had what you needed," I said. "That's all I ever tried to do." And that was true. From the beginning, that had always been the only thing I was trying to do. Not revenge. Not the satisfaction of watching a man who had dismissed me learned the precise cost of that dismissal, though I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I read that sentencing notice. Not the pleasure of being proven right about what I had seen in Marcus's eyes at that first dinner, over a steak on a menu with no prices. I was trying to make sure that my daughter had what she needed. To see clearly, to move safely, to know that someone was in her corner who understood the terrain. Everything else was just the law, doing what the law, at its best, is supposed to do. I fixed the gutters the following spring. It seemed like the right time.